In 1942, a radio signal was logged from an Arctic station that no country admitted building. That is the clean version of the story. The stranger version begins with what the recovery team did not find. No flag, no national seal, no maker's plate on the transmitter, no official Weather Service stamp on the instruments. There was a hut half buried in snow, 3 antenna masts leaning into the whiteout, and a receiver that still clicked when the door was opened. The station had been built carefully, too carefully to be abandoned by accident. The bunks were made, the fuel tins were stacked, the logbooks had been wrapped in oilcloth and placed inside a metal chest. But every mark that could have tied the station to a country had been removed, filed down, painted over, or written in a language nobody on the first team could read. At first, the explanation seemed obvious. It was a weather station. During the war, weather in the north was not background information. It could decide when aircraft flew, when ships moved, when convoys entered fog, and when ice closed a route. A small station in the Arctic could be worth more than a loud one in a city. The first room supported that explanation. There were barometers fixed to the wall. There were wind records. There were ice drift measurements written beside dates. There were trays of cloud photographs, some cracked from the cold, some still clean enough to show layered skies above a flat white horizon. If the recovery team had stopped there, Borealis 17 would have become one more unclaimed wartime weather post. But the second room did not behave like meteorology. It behaved like a room built for comparison. Everything had been duplicated. 2 clocks on opposite walls. 2 barographs, one beside the door and one beside the transmitter. 2 sets of cloud plates, one marked by date and one marked by number. Even the radio bench had 2 log positions, as if one operator was meant to record what the station sent and another was meant to record what the station heard back from itself. This is one of the details that made later investigators cautious. A hoax usually wants to look mysterious. Borealis 17 looked practical. The strangeness was not decorative. It was built into the workflow. The map was on the ceiling, not pinned to a desk, not folded in a drawer. Painted above the radio room, so an operator sitting below the transmitter would look up into a polar projection of the sky. It showed no borders, no capitals, no front lines, only pressure cells, aurora bands, cloud paths, convoy lanes, radio return points, and a set of red arcs that crossed the Arctic like routes on a transit map. That ceiling map is why later investigators divided the station into 3 possible purposes. They did not treat the hypotheses as separate stories. They treated them as layers. The first layer was what the station could admit to being. Weather. The second layer was what the station could deny if it was caught. Cipher work. The third layer was what the station could not safely explain, even to the people funding it. Relay. The first hypothesis was the easiest to defend and the hardest to say out loud. Borealis 17 may have been a weather seed center, not a machine that controlled the weather like a lever. Nothing that's simple. The notes suggest a smaller ambition, and therefore a more believable one, to make tiny interventions at the edge of a weather system and then wait for the atmosphere to carry the consequence somewhere useful. In a locked cabinet, the team found glass ampules packed in straw. Most had no labels. A few were marked with short words in the station's private language: Alba, Sal, Nix, Ventus. Inside the broken ampules was a pale metallic powder mixed with salt-like crystals. Beside them was a table of times, not weather observations, windows, seed window, pressure, drift, injection, altitude, return, cloud, expected. The words were not written in English, German, or French. That mattered. If this was a national project, it had been designed so that a captured page would not immediately accuse a nation. The pressure maps made the first hypothesis worse. Several dates were circled in red. On those dates, a small mark was drawn near the polar edge of a low-pressure system. Farther south, on the same map, convoy routes had been traced in pencil. The implication was not that the station could command a storm. The implication was that someone wanted to know whether a storm could be nudged. Could fog arrive 12 hours earlier? Could visibility fall over one stretch of water and remain open over another? Could a pressure ridge slow a crossing without anyone knowing it had been touched? The recovery scientists did not agree. Some said the ampules were ordinary cloud study samples. Some said the maps were after-the-fact analysis. But the station had a launch rail outside the north wall, angled into the wind, and the rail pointed not toward a settlement, not toward a ship lane, but toward the same red arcs painted on the ceiling. That was the first hypothesis. Weather seeding, and the station itself seemed designed to make that hypothesis deniable. The launch rail could be called a sampling rail. The ampules could be called cloud condensation tests. The pressure maps could be called forecast overlays. Every object had a harmless explanation if it was found alone. Only when they were placed together did the room begin to look like an attempt to touch the weather rather than describe it. The second hypothesis began in the darkroom. Hundreds of cloud plates hung from wire hooks, arranged not by date, not by altitude, and not by storm system. They were arranged in groups of numbers. 17422, 393, 011, 14, 14, 2. The first investigators assumed these were catalogue marks. Then they found the cards. A small wooden box sat under the enlarger. On the lid, in the same artificial language, someone had written Clavis Nubium, the key of clouds. Inside were 32 cards. Each card paired a cloud form with a number group, a timing interval, and a short Morse rhythm. Not letters, blocks. The system did not try to make a cloud look like a word. That would have been childish, and it would have failed. Instead, it treated cloud shape as a slow code surface. Height, spacing, thickness, delay, direction of formation. In this hypothesis, Borealis 17 was not only watching the weather, it was trying to write into it. The idea sounds impossible until the investigators looked at the duplicate plates. The same cloud form had been photographed from 3 different observation points on the same day. The angle changed, the landscape changed. But the pattern was close enough that the station staff had marked all 3 with the same number group. If the cloud cipher worked at all, it would have been slow, fragile, and nearly useless for ordinary messages. But it would have one advantage: deniability. A radio message can be intercepted. A codebook can be captured. A cloud can pass over a ship, a coast, or an empty horizon, and nobody can prove it was ever a message. The cloud hypothesis made the station feel less like a weather post and more like a theatre built for the sky. There was one more detail in the darkroom. On the back of several plates, the same instruction appeared in Lingua Borealis: Nubis non legit, nubis portat. The cloud does not read, the cloud carries. That line changed how the investigators read the room. The staff were not imagining the clouds as intelligent. They were imagining them as envelopes. Slow, unstable, enormous envelopes that could cross a horizon without looking like communication at all. But the third hypothesis is the one that kept returning in the logs. Borealis 17 may have been an attempt to build a satellite before satellites. Not with metal in orbit, with the upper atmosphere. The antenna field outside the station was wrong for a normal outpost. Several masts were not aimed toward known receiving stations. They were pitched upward, toward the auroral oval, as if the operators were not calling another human station at all. On the wall behind the transmitter, a diagram called the Setup Speculum Coeli, the sky mirror. Another sheet called it a delay ladder. The same test phrase was sent at fixed intervals. The same phrase returned, sometimes after 7 minutes, sometimes after 41, sometimes after 3 hours. The first returns could be explained as echo, reflection, interference, or bad logging. The later returns were harder. The Morse strips show the same block reappearing with tiny changes, as though the sky was not merely reflecting the message but scraping it, delaying it, and handing it back in pieces. The operators started to record 2 times for every test. Sent, received. Then the impossible entries began. Received, 21, sent, all 14. Received, 322. Sent, 331. 1 page might be an error. 3 pages might be panic. 27 entries in the same careful hand begin to look like either a system failure or a discovery nobody wanted to name. This is where the language matters. The people who built Borealis 17 did not use normal military language. They wrote in a constructed field code later called Lingua Borealis. At first glance it looks like broken Latin, but it is not meant to be read as Latin. It is a technical protocol built from Latin roots, chosen because Latin did not point cleanly to Germany, Britain, France, or any single modern state. If the station was captured, the pages would not immediately betray who paid for the wood, the wire, the fuel, or the transmitter. But the language did more than hide nationality. It compressed the experiment. Ventus did not mean wind. It meant transmission band. Alba did not mean white. It meant cloud density. Speculum did not mean mirror. It meant auroral return layer. Tacit did not mean silence. It meant stop transmitting and listen passively. Horror did not simply mean hour. It meant schedule. The station's language was both disguise and machine instruction. It was a way for people from different countries, or people pretending not to belong to any country, to work inside the same system without leaving obvious fingerprints. That is one reason no country admitted building the station. There were no fingerprints to admit. But the language also created a second kind of protection. Even if an enemy copied the pages, they would not know whether they were looking at weather notes, prayer fragments, school Latin, or operational code. That ambiguity was not an accident. It was the station's first line of camouflage. The hut was camouflaged with snow. The documents were camouflaged with dead language. The second reason was location. The coordinates in the logs do not describe solid land. They describe ice, moving ice. A platform that drifts just enough to become nobody's territory when ownership becomes inconvenient. If the station is found, every country can say it was not on its soil. If the language is found, every country can say it is not its language. If the instruments are found, every country can say it was only weather. And if the sky itself began returning messages out of order, every country had a better reason to remain silent. The abandonment was not chaotic. That may be the most unsettling detail. No bullet holes, no burned radio room, no smashed instruments, no emergency note nailed to the door. The station was not destroyed. It was closed, deliberately. The final week of the log shows 3 failures converging. First, the weather tables stop matching the observations. The operators write a pressure change before the barograph records it. At first, they correct the entries. Then they stop correcting them. One operator draws a small vertical line beside each impossible timestamp, as if marking errors for review. By the 5th page, the marks are gone. The impossible order has become part of the record. Then the cloud plates receive number groups that appear in the codebook only 2 days later. Finally, the radio room begins receiving its own schedule, not its messages, its schedule, transmission times, listening windows, seed windows. The sky, if the logs are trusted, had begun returning not only what the station said, but when the station planned to speak. On the last day, the operators did not remove the main antenna. They buried it. The cable runs out through the north wall, drops into a trench, and disappears beneath the ice. That is not how a normal weather team closes a post. It is how someone hides a part of a machine they are afraid someone else might restart. The food stores were left behind, the spare valves were left behind, the plates were left behind, but the portable transmitter was gone. So were 3 pages from the codebook. That absence is important. The station was not abandoned by people fleeing the cold. It was abandoned by people taking only the piece that could make the experiment travel. The final line appears on a narrow Morse strip, then again in the logbook, then once more at the edge of the ceiling map. 3 copies, 3 media. 1 phrase, Calum didicit horam. The sky has learned the hour. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a joke written by exhausted operators in a room where the clocks no longer agreed. Maybe it was the only honest sentence left in a station built to deny its own origin. But if the third hypothesis is even whether the sky could be addressed. Paris had tried to make pressure carry instructions through tubes. This station tried to make the upper atmosphere carry instructions through light, cloud, and radio. Both stories end in the same place. Not with a machine refusing to work, with a system obeying too well, and with people discovering that a message is never just a message once the thing carrying it begins to remember.